Bette Davis had 4 marriages and 4 divorces. 4 times she walked down the aisle thinking this would be the one. 4 times it all fell apart. And if you look at the pattern of how these relationships crashed and burned, you start to see why one of Hollywood's most talented actresses could never make love last. The thing about Bette Davis is that she was never going to be the quiet wife sitting at home waiting for her husband to come back from work. She was ambitious, she was fierce, and she had zero interest in playing second fiddle to any man. In the 1930s and 40s, this was not what most men wanted in a wife. They wanted someone who would support their career, not compete with it. But Betty's problem wasn't just that she was ahead of her time. Her marriages failed for much deeper reasons, and when you dig into the details of each relationship, you see the same destructive patterns over and over again. Let's start with husband number 1, Ham Nelson. Bette married him in 1932 when she was just starting to make it in Hollywood. Ham was actually her high school sweetheart from Massachusetts. They'd been together since they were teenagers, and he followed her out to California when she got her first movie contract. Now here's where things get messy right from the start. Ham Nelson was a musician, but he wasn't exactly setting the world on fire with his career. Meanwhile, Bette was landing bigger and bigger movie roles. She went from small parts to starring in major films pretty quickly. The money she was making dwarfed anything Ham could bring in. This created a power imbalance that neither of them knew how to handle. Ham felt like less of a man because his wife was the breadwinner. Bette felt frustrated because Ham seemed content to just coast along while she was working her butt off to build a career. But the real killer for this marriage was Betty's affair with her director, George Arliss. She was filming The Man Who Played God in 1932, and she fell hard for the much older, much more sophisticated Arliss. Ham knew what was going on, but he didn't know how to compete with a successful, worldly director who could offer Bette things he couldn't. The marriage limped along for about 6 years, but it was basically over after that affair. Bette had tasted what it was like to be with a man who was her intellectual equal, someone who could challenge her artistically. Ham never stood a chance after that. They finally divorced in 1938, and here's what's telling about how it ended. The official reason given was mental cruelty. But what that really meant was that Bette had become impossible to live with. She was demanding, she was moody, and she expected Ham to just deal with whatever drama was happening in her career. Ham later said in interviews that living with Bette was like living with a tornado. She would come home from the studio either on top of the world or in the depths of despair, and he never knew which version of her he was going to get. So marriage number 1 fails because Bette outgrew her teenage sweetheart and couldn't resist the pull of a more exciting man. But you'd think she would have learned something from this experience. She didn't. Husband number 2 was Arthur Farnsworth, and this one might be the most tragic of all her marriages. Bette married him in 1940, and Arthur seemed different from Ham. He was an engineer, he had his own career, and he wasn't trying to ride on Betty's coattails. But Arthur had one major problem. He drank a lot. And when he drank, he became a completely different person. Bette would come home from long days on movie sets to find Arthur passed out on the couch or picking fights with the neighbors. The weird thing is that Bette thought she could fix him. She had this idea that her love would be enough to make him stop drinking. She even tried to control his drinking by hiding alcohol in the house and monitoring who he spent time with. This marriage lasted about 2 years, and it ended in the most horrible way possible. Arthur died in 1943, and the circumstances were suspicious. He fell down some stairs at their home and hit his head. Some people whispered that maybe it wasn't an accident, that maybe Bette had pushed him during one of their fights about his drinking. Nothing was ever proven, and Bette was never charged with anything. But the gossip followed her for years. She always claimed that Arthur's death was a tragic accident, that he had been drinking and just lost his balance. Whether you believe that or not, Arthur's death messed Bette up psychologically. She felt guilty about not being able to save him from his alcoholism. She also felt guilty about the time she had lost her temper with him when he was drunk. This guilt and trauma made her even more difficult to be in a relationship with. She became more controlling, more suspicious of people's motives, and less willing to be vulnerable with anyone. Marriage number 3 was to William Sherry in 1945. And this guy was probably the worst possible match for Bette. Sherry was an artist, but not a particularly successful one. He was handsome and charming, and Bette was probably attracted to the idea of having a creative partner. But Sherry had a massive ego and a terrible temper. He was also physically abusive. Bette later wrote in her autobiography that Sherry would hit her during arguments and that she was genuinely afraid of him sometimes. The crazy thing is that Bette stayed with him for 5 years and even had a daughter with him. Her daughter, Barbara Davis Hyman, was born in 1947. You'd think having a child would either bring them together or give Bette the motivation to leave an abusive situation. Instead, It just made everything more complicated. Sherry was jealous of Bette's career and jealous of the attention she gave to their daughter. He wanted to be the center of her world, but that was never going to happen. Bette's career came first, always. And now she had a child to think about, too. The marriage got so bad that Bette started having affairs just to get away from Sherry. She had relationships with other actors and directors, partly because she was lonely, and partly because she was trying to prove to herself that she was still desirable. Sherry knew about the affairs and would fly into rages about them. The house became a war zone. Their daughter Barbara later wrote about growing up in this environment and how scary it was to hear her parents screaming at each other all the time. They divorced in 1950, and the custody battle over Barbara was nasty. Sherry tried to use Bette's affairs against her in court, claiming she was an unfit mother. Bette fought back by highlighting his drinking and abusive behavior. In the end, she got custody, but the whole ordeal left her even more cynical about love and marriage. Now you'd think that after 3 failed marriages, Bette would maybe take a break from the whole marriage thing. But no, she jumped right into marriage number 4 with Gary Merrill in 1950. Gary Merrill was an actor who had appeared with Bette in the movie All About Eve. They had great chemistry on screen, and Bette convinced herself that this meant they would have great chemistry in real life, too. Merrill seemed like he might be different. He was a successful actor in his own right, so he wouldn't be intimidated by Bette's fame. He was also tough enough to stand up to her when she got difficult. Bette thought she had finally found her equal. For a while, it looked like this marriage might actually work. They adopted 2 children together, and Bette seemed happier than she had been in years. She even scaled back her career a bit to focus on being a wife and mother. But here's the thing about Bette Davis. She couldn't turn off the part of her personality that had made her a star. She was still demanding, still dramatic, still needed to be the center of attention. And Gary Merrill, despite being a successful actor himself, eventually got tired of dealing with her mood swings and her need to control everything. The marriage started falling apart in the late 1950s. Gary began drinking heavily, just like Arthur Farnsworth had. Bette tried to control his drinking the same way she had tried to control Arthur's, and it worked about as well as you'd expect. They also fought constantly about money and career decisions. Bette was used to making all the financial decisions because she had always been the bigger earner in her relationships. But Gary had his own money and his own career, and he didn't want to be managed by his wife. The fights got so bad that their adopted children were affected. Their son Michael later talked about how he and his sister would hide in their rooms when their parents started screaming at each other. Gary and Bette divorced in 1960 after 10 years of marriage. This was Bette's longest marriage, but even a decade wasn't enough time for her to learn how to be a true partner to someone. After 4 divorces, Bette finally gave up on marriage. She had a few more relationships over the years, but she never walked down the aisle again. She seemed to accept that she just wasn't built for marriage. So why couldn't Bette Davis stay married? The pattern is pretty clear when you look at all 4 relationships. First, she was addicted to drama. Bette thrived on conflict and intensity. She needed the highs and lows, the passion and the fighting. A calm, stable relationship bored her. She would unconsciously create problems just to make things more exciting. Second, she could never truly share power in a relationship. Even when she married men who had their own careers and their own money, she still needed to be in control. She made the major decisions, she managed the finances, she decided where they lived and how they lived. Third, she used her career as a weapon in her relationships. When things got difficult with a husband, she would throw herself even more deeply into her work. She would take on more projects, stay at the studio later, and basically use her job as an excuse to avoid dealing with problems at home. Fourth, she had impossibly high standards for her partners, but she didn't apply those same standards to herself. She expected her husbands to be understanding when she was difficult, but she had no patience for their flaws and weaknesses. And finally, she never really learned how to be emotionally intimate with someone. She could be passionate and dramatic, but she couldn't be vulnerable and open. She kept her deepest fears and insecurities locked away, which made it impossible for her husbands to truly know her. The sad thing is that Bette probably would have been happier if she had been born in a different era. If she had been a young woman in the 1970s or 1980s, she might have found men who were more comfortable with strong, successful women. She might have been able to have a career and a marriage without having to choose between them. But in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, most men couldn't handle being married to a woman who was more famous, more successful, and more driven than they were. And Bette couldn't handle being anything less than the star of her own life. Her daughter Barbara wrote a book about growing up with Bette as a mother, and she said something that really sums up why Bette's marriages failed. She said that Bette was always performing, even at home. She could never just be a regular person having a regular conversation with her husband. Everything had to be dramatic. Everything had to be intense. That's exhausting to live with. Even the most patient, understanding person would eventually get worn down by that level of constant drama. But here's what's interesting. Bette never really seemed to regret her choices. In her later interviews, she would talk about her failed marriages, but she never sounded like she wished she had done things differently. She seemed to accept that her career and her personality were more important to her than having a successful marriage. She once said in an interview, "I would rather be a really good actress than a really good wife," and that pretty much sums up her priorities. She wasn't willing to compromise her ambition or tone down her personality to make a man happy. You have to respect that, even if it meant she spent a lot of her life alone. Bette Davis knew who she was and what she wanted, and she wasn't going to pretend to be someone else just to keep a husband. But it also explains why she went through 4 marriages and 4 divorces. She kept hoping she would find a man who could handle the real her, but she never did, and maybe that man didn't exist in her generation. The story of Bette Davis's marriages is really a story about what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. She was a force of nature who couldn't be contained or controlled, and marriage in her era was an institution that expected women to be contained and controlled. Something had to give, and it was always the marriage. Bette Davis could never stay married because staying married would have required her to be someone she fundamentally wasn't, and to her credit, she chose to be herself rather than live a lie. That might not have made her happy in the traditional sense, but it made her one of the greatest actresses who ever lived, and maybe that was worth more to her than a successful marriage ever could have been.